is done with a very, very simple system, A, B, C, D, which we unfold. We see its cause-effect powers unfolded here, a cause-effect structure with some decent phi value. And here a much larger physical system of 55 gates as opposed to 4, which is actually able to simulate in detail, indefinitely, the behavior of this system. So this is a computer that simulates this little system, okay? If you consider these two in physical terms as two substrates and you unfold them, you unfold the computer, and far from getting a large cause-effect structure, you get a bunch of mini entities indicated here corresponding to their memory registers and the clock. And the computer as a whole is nothing at all. Its phi is 0. In this case, because it's feed-forward, but it doesn't even matter. It's just the architecture has a bottleneck, is very bad for integrating information. So it does all the things this other system does, but it has no intrinsic existence, no consciousness as such. Being is not doing. And so when we get to our own subset of consciousness, let's say primarily in posterior cortical areas, which unfolded would be a giant cause-effect structure, as I indicated to you, at least when we are awake or dreaming, a large computer, because it's a computer, that would simulate it, might be able to do all the things we do, but there would be nothing there. There would be nobody home, no consciousness, except for this minimal set of micro entities corresponding to the memory registers and the clock, which in the end, leads to the final slide. That is that there is a double dissociation between consciousness and intelligence. Usually we tend to consider them together because there are reasons, I won't discuss them now. We actually published a paper on this, while with a selective pressure, you might actually get that, generally speaking, consciousness and intelligence sort of may grow together. But in general, you could have a supercomputer that is very intelligent and has no consciousness whatsoever, and an organoid in the proper condition that may even be conscious, let's say, of space, but be totally stupid because it cannot do anything. It doesn't even have inputs and outputs. So in essence, we take a substrate model. We imagine we have a bunch of neurons connected in a certain way, usually our very simplified neurons, where we can observe and manipulate everything we want. We take the system, for instance, these 4 units, and we take this input and output 2 extra neurons as background condition, which means we causally condition them, we fix them. And then we can obtain the transition probability matrix, the TPM, that says for every initial state, what is the probability that the system will get into any other state given those fixed background conditions, okay? And so that is the starting point. The TPM is essentially an ideal summary of this causal substrate. What unfolding does is we can't just take the TPM that contains all that, if you wish, implicitly. We must make the causal powers explicit. And to make them explicit, we not only consider causal powers and the ones that are within the system, not outside, that's intrinsicality, but we go to composition. So we consider the causal powers of all the parts of the system. A is a part, B is a part, C is a part potentially, A, B is a part, that's composition. So there is a power set that you need to try out to see whether it has causal powers as a part within the system. You do it for all the parts. And there is causal power also in the relations, meaning if 2 mechanisms have a cause or an effect and they overlap, that is an additional causal fact that we capture. It has to be specific. So we actually say, what is the cause? Is it A on, B off, C off, or is it A off, B on, C off? That's for every cause and for every effect. And it only exists, it's only causal, if it cannot be reduced to independent components. If, for instance, what A does within the system and what B does within the system is something, but what A, B together do is nothing above and beyond what A does and what B does, then that doesn't count. That is not a mechanism that has causal power within the system. So we work out all those mechanisms, all the parts of the system that have causal power within, but irreducible causal power. And then the final step in unfolding is we say, okay, we started with a particular candidate substrate, A, B, C, D. But we could have taken ABC, AB, ABCDE, a much larger substrate, anything, okay? But consciousness is definite. It contains what it contains, not less and not more. So how do we adjudicate, okay? And so we find the borders of this entity by unfolding in full, say, ABCD, and asking how much does it exist as an entity, And that's what phi measures, this much. And how much would a subset of it, for instance, ABC, exist? Or a superset of it, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, whatever. And over a substrate, the one that exists is the one that exists the most. This is called the maximum existing principle. That gives us borders and automatically excludes anything that is either a subset of it or a superset of it or a paraset, which means it's partially overlapping with it. And so everything which I will show now, it's a good introduction to the next part, everything that is not the maximally existent entity is excluded, okay? So everything condenses down into these maximally existing entities to the implications for free will. And I'll call it, broadly speaking, the intrinsic existence view, because it will be compared briefly to what I think is the more common way to think about everything, including free will, which is the extrinsic existence view. So then I'll remind you, we start from the experience, we finally come up with the idea that to account for the experience in physical terms, we need to fully unfold the substrate and reveal all its causal powers. And we get this global maximum of intrinsic, structure, specific, irreducible cause-effect power as dictated by the postulates. The quality is the form, that is all the distinction relations, and the quantity is how irreducible it is. I also, discuss, for instance, space. The idea is that any content of an experience, like the extendedness of the visual field, the feeling of time flowing, an object like my body I might be seeing, and the colors, et cetera, everything that exists as a content of an experience exists physically according to IT. Everything is physical in this very precise way of understanding physics as operational cause-effect power. And to be more specific, it is a substructure within the cause-effect structure. So if you're having this experience right now when you wake up from your dreamless nap, then it's a giant cause-effect structure indicated here in gray, only partially. And within that, distinct contents, like for instance, the feeling of extendedness, is a substructure. And objects will be other substructures and so on and so forth. So here, the key message I want to get across then is that if what exists immediately and indubitably, which I say truly for simplicity, is experience, and if experience has 5 essential properties, the action of IIT, and if a physical substrate is an operational basis, note, not a supervenience basis, is an operational basis, we can play around with it, observe and manipulate. That's all we can do physically, okay? Always as conscious being, by the way, consciousness is always first, is a set of units in a state, like neurons in the brain. And we fully unfold its causal powers. People normally don't do that. They think about the substrate and then just see what it does. But we want to actually fully unfold its causal powers, which is what IT allows you to do, in principle, at least for simple systems. And then the key thing to realize is that what truly exists, what is identical to the experience, is the cause-effect structure and not the substrate as such. It's a key message to try and get across. We are used to the brain, the neurons, what we observe, manipulate is what exists, and then it carries stuff on top of it. We'll get to that in a moment. But IIT tells you, what exists is the substrate unfolded, the cause-effect structure, not the substrate as such. And so here, I want to give you sort of a visual sense of what that means. Then for any substrate, say the brain, okay, IIT requires that you in principle would unfold it completely. And it will yield, once you do this full unfolding, when you see all its causal powers, one, for instance, giant intrinsic entity, one giant cause-effect structure indicated here, sort of like a giant cruise ship, if you wish, surrounded by a huge number of little sailing boats, as it were, which are these mini entities like the cerebellum and probably parts of prefrontal cortex and all kinds of other things. And they are disjoint. None of these entities overlap. What there truly is, if the IT picture is correct, is a bunch of intrinsic entities, some very large, like our own consciousness, and some very small, like stuff that sort of exists in cerebellum, prefrontal cortex, spinal cord, and everywhere else, so to speak, interacting among themselves. That's just exclusion in action, if you wish. It's called horizontal exclusion because you cannot have overlap between these intrinsic entities. And then there is a vertical exclusion, which I didn't really discuss at length. I only mentioned that we have several papers on that, which says that these entities exist based on units that have a particular grain, a grain like neurons versus microcolumns, mini columns, you name it, or anything smaller than that, proteins, atoms, elementary particles. And here it's indicated, for instance, the grain could be neurons. I think this is an open question, one we're actively working on. Is it neurons that have maximal power, or is it anything coarser or finer? Is it over 20 milliseconds or 2 milliseconds or microseconds? Probably not. Or seconds, tens of seconds. There is going to be one grain and a particular set of states at which intrinsic existence phi is maximum. So there is horizontal and vertical exclusion. What truly exists is a bunch, in physical terms, a bunch of intrinsic entities, each of which with substructure, with their particular contents, at a particular grain, period, okay? Now, what we typically do, which is absolutely fine empirically, is we look at it extrinsically. We can analyze, study physically anything we want, any set, any superset, any subset at any grain we want. We can study the body, we can study the brain, we can study parts of the brain like posterior cortex, we can study the fusiform phase area within it. Anything we want, we can study operationally, physically, and find cause-effect power, of course. And we can do this at the level of neurons, at the level of channels, proteins, atoms, if you wish, or mini columns. Anything is fair as long as you can show physical existence. But that's okay for explaining things, for accounting for things, and that's the domain, of course, of the spatial sciences. But it's not okay ontologically. The principle that matters here, I will not show the others from IIT, follows from the maximum existence principle. It can be called the no free existence principle. Cause-effect power cannot be multiplied over the same substrate. So in other words, once we unfold all the causal powers of, say, posterior cortex, you cannot physically have those powers as well as the powers of the supersets, like the cortex, the brain, the body, all on top of it, okay? Or subsets, posterior cortex, but also the causal powers of fusiform phase area and also the ones of particular subregions of it. There's only a set of disjoint entities. That's the horizontal exclusion. And you cannot physically have coexist the causal powers of neurons, if they are the fundamental unit, as well as that of their organelles, their proteins, their atoms, as well as that of the mini columns, voxels, and regions to which they contribute. So there is, anything you can do is fair, but in the end, what truly exists are only distinct, disjoint intrinsic entities at a particular grain. That's the intrinsic existence view versus the extrinsic existence view. And now here we come to the ontology, so to speak, that's relevant also for free will. So this whole story says that when I am conscious or whatever, I exist intrinsically as a cause-effect structure in physical terms, not as a substrate. And of course, only I exist, not my subset, supersets, or parasets, and at the grain at which I exist, not at finer and coarser grains. Now, anything that's the content of my experience also truly exists, but it exists physically as a substructure within a cause-effect structure. That's true for space, time, objects, and colors that I might experience. It's true for thoughts and feelings. It's true for alternative reasons, decisions, will, intentions, agency, self-values, you name it. Problems, solutions, question answers, anything you might think of. So what I indicate here are different experiences, so to speak, that you might have at different moments, which is what exists, and within it, different contents, okay, that have their particular shape. And perhaps the most important message here for this part about the freedom as opposed to the will, if we go back to our sort of paradigmatic free will scenario, a very, very crucial step in my mind is the existence of alternative courses of action. The moment I, in a typical deliberative process, I think to myself, consciously, I could do this or that, which is a typical thing, where that could also be not this, it doesn't matter.